With all of the information on the news about the supply chain crisis and the food shortage issues that we are learning about more and more every day, it's really important as homemakers for us to be able to make food on our own from scratch so that we're not so reliant on the supply chain that is obviously so volatile and undependable. Today, I wanted to teach you how to make your own sourdough starter just with flour and water in your own kitchen, and also go through the steps of making a loaf of sourdough bread. The ingredients are very simple. There's only 3 ingredients: flour, salt, and water. And once you get a few loaves under your belt, your confidence level will grow and you will learn to enjoy making your own sourdough bread. Hey, I'm Lori. Welcome back to Homemade Simple. I'm so glad you're here today. If you have ever eaten homemade sourdough bread, you know that it is a unique taste and texture. It is such a nourishing food that you can make easily in your own home. It's very interesting how it works because it just uses the active cultures, the active bacteria in your air, in your kitchen, to feed and nourish the flour, and it begins a fermentation process. The fermentation of the sourdough bread is what makes it so healthy and nourishing. It increases a lot of the beneficial vitamins and minerals in the flour, and it also creates its own. So it is full of all of the B vitamins. There's folate, iron, calcium, so many good and beneficial vitamins and minerals are available in sourdough starter, and that is one reason why it's such a good thing to learn how to make in your own kitchen. Also, if you have any issues with blood sugar, it will level out your blood sugar throughout the day when you eat sourdough. And also, if you or your family have any heart health issues, sourdough bread is very heart healthy. It reduces the risk of heart disease just by consuming it on a daily basis. So as you can see, sourdough bread is a really important part of a nutritious diet, and I wanted to talk about the how-tos on making your own sourdough starter. There's lots of ways that you can come up with a sourdough starter. If you have friends that have their own sourdough starter going, it's very easy to get a small amount from them and bring it into your own kitchen and start feeding it so that you can have a continuous supply of starter yourself. You can also buy sourdough starter. They sell it dehydrated or even liquid form, and those are easily accessible online. But if you don't want to go those routes, it's very simple to make your own sourdough starter with just flour and water. When you are making your sourdough starter, you only need 2 ingredients. You need flour and water. And I like to use the King Arthur all-purpose flour. I will put a link down below on Amazon to get this flour. It's also available at Walmart, Publix, other stores. But this seems to be a very good, trustworthy source for your sourdough starter. It always starts well, and that's important for when you begin your own starter. I already have some in this container, and so I will add probably half a cup or so to this mason jar, and then add about half a cup or so of water to begin with. You just want to get it good and mixed in. You don't want it to be too watery, but you don't want it to be too thick either. So as you go along, you will learn the right consistency, but it's sort of like a paste consistency when you get finished. That's really all there is to your sourdough starter. So that's sort of the consistency you're looking for. And all you have to do after you mix it up is cover it with either a coffee filter or a cotton rag and let it sit for a day. Check it and see if it's got bubbles. If the bubbles are forming, that means you're on the right track. If you don't quite have bubbles yet, it's okay. It might take a couple of days for the bacteria in your air to get into and begin to ferment the flour. So it's not all lost until it's a week and you don't have bubbles. So just secure the fabric or coffee filter with a mason jar ring, and you'll want to check it every day. Now, I leave mine out on the counter and I feed mine frequently. So every day, every other day, I like to feed the starter. If you don't want to feed it quite so often, you can put it in the refrigerator and it will go a week or so without needing to be fed. While it is beginning to grow the bacteria that it needs in order to create the starter, just leave it on the counter and check it every day. And you'll also want to feed it every day. So you'll want to add half a cup of flour and half a cup of water, mix it together, and every day come back and check it. You'll probably have to pour half of it out every day so that it won't fill up the mason jar. After several days, you should be able to see bubbles in your starter. And I will open the lid and show you what it looks like from the inside. The bubbles are what indicates that it's active and ready to use. So when you have bubbles throughout your starter, you know that you're ready to make your first batch of sourdough bread. So when your starter is alive and active and ready to go, you only need 4 simple ingredients to get your loaf of bread started. You will need 3 cups of all-purpose flour, half a cup of your starter, 2 teaspoons of salt, and 1 1/4 cup of warm water. So I'm gonna mix all of those in, and then we will begin to knead the dough. Now that you have the ingredients all in the bowl, just stir it until it gets to be a more dough-like consistency, and then you can begin kneading it with your hands. There's a chance that you'll need to add more flour or more water just to get it to the right consistency. This is not a dough that you want to be dry like you would normally have a homemade bread recipe. It would normally be pretty dry and not sticky. Sourdough bread tends to be on the stickier side, and that makes it more moist in the end product. So it might be hard to deal with at the beginning, but it will give you a better end result if you leave it a little bit sticky. So after it's combined to the point where you can mess with it with your fingers, if you fold it on top of itself over and over, it will begin incorporating, and then you can see how the consistency is if you need to add a little more flour or a little more water. I tend to have too wet of a dough to begin with, and I normally have to add flour, but I think that this one is just like it should be. It's gonna get messy, it's gonna stick on your fingers. That's perfectly normal. After you've got it into a manageable ball, fold it on top of itself, pull and stretch it a couple of times to help incorporate it. And this is sort of what you're gonna be left with. It's gonna be a sticky ball of dough, but that's really just how you want it. So place it back in the mixing bowl. You'll want to cover it with a tea towel and leave this to rise for at least 8 hours. That seems like a really long time, but that's how long it's going to need to create all of the healthy bubbles inside and get it ready for the second rise. This is a loaf that I started yesterday and allowed to rise overnight. Now this is a double batch, and so it's going to look like more, but I wanted to show you what it does overnight. See how it has grown and it has really developed a really good set of bubbles. This is perfect. This is exactly what you want. You want it to be filled up and very full of air and bubbles. That's going to create the sour flavor of the dough, and also it shows that the bacteria is working in the bread, and that is what's going to give you the prebiotics, which is going to be good for your gut health, and also it's going to help your heart health and also stabilize your blood sugars. That is what is done by this rising. So if it's not rising like it should, that means that the starter is not quite healthy enough to make a loaf, and so you just need to give it another day or so and allow it to continue to grow and ferment. When you put it onto the counter, you'll want to have some flour so that it doesn't stick. Again, remember that it's going to be pretty wet and sticky. And if you have one, a dough scraper is also going to help you. So you don't want to destroy all of the bubbles that have been growing overnight. So you just want to sort of gingerly take your dough scraper and pull the bread out. Overworking the bread dough at this point is not going to be good for the dough, and it will not rise like you want it to for the second rise. So just gingerly roll it into a ball. You don't want to knead it, you don't want to be hard with it, but you do want to sort of cover it with flour. That will help it not stick whenever you put it in the proofing bowls. Now if you don't have something like this that is called a proofing bowl, you can use a regular bowl, and what you'll want to do is cover the bowl or the proofing basket with flour so that the sourdough loaf does not stick as it's rising. There are circular proofing bowls, there are oval proofing bowls. Sometimes you can, instead of using flour, they come with this removable cloth, and you can just flour the cloth. This is not necessary, but I find that just using the proofing basket with flour works just fine. So I'm going to divide this into quarters because this was a double recipe. But if you've made one recipe, then you'll just cut it in half. So I'll put 2 of these away. One I'm going to add into the proofing basket. So you just roll it into a dough ball and place the flour side down and cover it with a tea towel or a kitchen towel and allow it to proof or rise for another hour to 2 hours. Another option that you have if you don't have a proofing basket is you can use a regular glass loaf pan. I'm going to take the rest of the dough that I proofed yesterday and I'm going to place it in these 2 loaf pans. Alright, the loaves have risen for a little over 2 hours and it's time for me to take them out of the proofing basket. So you can see that it has risen quite a bit, maybe almost doubled. It's not going to rise like it did in the first rise overnight or for the 8-hour rise, but it has risen significantly and I can see some bubbles, so I know that it's ready to turn over onto the parchment paper. So you can find reusable parchment paper on Amazon, but I think parchment paper really works the best. So whenever it's time to bake the loaves, you'll take the bowl and insert it onto the parchment paper, and hopefully if I've floured the bowl like it needs to be, it will come out. Now this one feels like it's having a little bit of trouble in a place or two coming out of the bowl, but that's okay. It shouldn't damage the end product too much. So the proofing basket leaves a little bit of a design on the bottom, which is now the top, but we still need to score some lines in the dough. The reason that you do this is so that the bread will rise evenly as it's cooking. So you can be as creative as you want to be. I'm not very artistic, so I'm just going to put a cross design in the bread, and that way it will sort of separate as it bakes. As it rises, it will allow the loaf to expand as it needs to. And the trick for scoring is to make enough of a cut or a score so that the top layer or film of the loaf is punctured, but not to actually damage the inner core of the bread. You don't want to go so far down that you damage the rise that has happened over the last couple of hours. So this should do just fine. Now, the way you bake sourdough bread most effectively is in a Dutch oven. I know a lot of people may not have a Dutch oven. If you have a little extra in your budget one month, this is a really good place to spend some extra money. When you bake bread on a regular basis, having a Dutch oven is going to make a lot of difference. And the reason is because you can cover it for the first part of the bake, and it will allow the bread to sort of steam itself as it bakes, and that makes the best loaf. So I have a Dutch oven here. I will link this particular Dutch oven down below, but pretty much any Dutch oven that you find will work just as well. So you take your parchment paper and you carefully lift it up, and you want to place it right into the Dutch oven. And you see how the paper is going to crumple around. That's fine, it's not a problem. But the main thing you want to do is make sure that it's centered as much as possible, and then you're going to place the lid on the Dutch oven, and you're going to bake it covered at 450 degrees. Now, if you don't have a Dutch oven, that's okay, because I have learned that you can actually make regular loaf-size loaves of sourdough just in a glass loaf pan. And it's pretty much the same thing, except you're not going to invert it onto parchment paper. I just normally, when I'm making a loaf of sourdough, I will just put a couple of straight lines in it. And there's nothing beautiful about that, but you do want to make sure that you puncture the first thicker layer of the loaf so that it can expand as it needs to and cook evenly. So I will bake this loaf just as it is in a 450 degree oven for about 30 to 40 minutes. When your loaves are put into the oven, it's a good time to go ahead and refeed your sourdough starter. You will want to make sure and feed your starter every day, or at least every other day if you're going to keep it out in room temperature. If you don't want to feed your starter every day, you don't have to. You can put it in the refrigerator, and then you will only have to feed it once a week. You will need to remove it the day before you're ready to make your bread. It will have time to liven up before you bake your bread. So when you feed your starter, add about a half a cup of flour. and about a half a cup of water. You just want it to have a pasty consistency. Stir it around until it's all combined. It's really important that you don't use metal utensils when you're working with your sourdough starter. The metal can interfere with the bacteria and the fermentation process, and it will ruin your starter. So try to use either silicone or wooden spoons or spatulas whenever you're working with your starter. Once you have it well combined, cover it with either a coffee filter or a cotton fabric. I use cloth napkins, and then screw on your ring until it's tight. That will keep any fruit flies or dirt or other debris from flying into your starter and keep it safe until the next time you feed it. Because you feed your starter every day, it's going to grow and grow and grow until you have more than you can possibly use for sourdough bread alone. There's lots of good uses for your sourdough starter discard, and I know that you can find some really great recipes online. I have found a really good sourdough pancake recipe. I will place that recipe down below in the description box. And I have even used the discard in place of some of the flour and water and biscuit dough, and it has come out really good. Anytime you can incorporate sourdough starter discard in your baked goods, it will increase the nutrient value of those baked goods tremendously. You can store the discard in a mason jar in the refrigerator. It will be good for a really long time. Okay, they're all done baking now, and I wanted to show you the results. The one that I left in the glass loaf pan, but I didn't cut the scores in it. It actually looks just as good as the one with the scores. So let it rise and bake it in the glass loaf pan that you don't have to score it, and it will cook evenly. See that it easily releases. It's not a really tall bread. It's maybe just a couple of inches. It does make really good sandwich bread, but it's more like a half a piece of bread than a whole regular loaf. Now for the classic circular sourdough loaf. This one cooks up really good. Of course, my scores are not beautiful and it doesn't look beautiful on top, but I'm sure that the inside will taste just the same whether it's beautiful or not. It cooked evenly. It didn't rise much. Don't expect it to poof up like normal bread does, but this bread is going to be really good for dinner. You can cut it, put butter and honey or maple syrup, and this is a wonderful dessert. It is going to be a nutritious option, but also really delicious. Well, I'm really glad that you were here today to bake some sourdough bread with me. I hope that in testing the different methods of baking sourdough bread, you were able to decide which method will work best for you. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I hope that you have a wonderful week. Thanks for being here. I love you, and I'll see you next time.